So everything about mainstream economics at that time was about demand shocks. And the idea that there would be aggregate supply shocks seemed quite unusual, maybe for an individual country, but at a world scale seemed unusual. In the 1970s, the supply shocks were energy supply shocks, not unlike today, but they came from two wars in the Middle East, and from the rise of OPEC, not from the war in Ukraine, for example, and everything that has come afterwards. We also didn't have in the 1970s a pandemic. That's a massive supply shock as well that we're not done with. And we didn't have global scale climate shocks underway either. There was, of course, climate change already happening, but now we're in the year-to-year worldwide environmental shocks reality. It's not a small thing. Europe had mega drought this year. China had a mega drought this year. The United States had a mega drought this year. Many places had huge floods this year. Many places had intense hurricanes this year. This is the yearly norm now, and it's only going to get more extreme because we already have a temperature increase of 1.2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial level, and the rate of warming has accelerated. So we're warming at a rate of more than 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So we'll be above 1.5 degrees by the 2030s. We'll exceed that target. And maybe even in the next few years when we go from the La Nina phase that we're in now to an El Nino phase, which will happen soon, that could actually push the Earth's temperature above 1.5 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels. So we have a massive number of supply shocks. And today our supply shocks started with the pandemic, then the direct effects of the war in Ukraine, then the effects of the sanctions regime, then the effects of somebody, the United States probably, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, then the effects of the climate shocks that are pervasive worldwide. 4 big supply shocks. Probably all of them, even including the pandemic, human-made. So just one word about the pandemic. I chaired a commission for The Lancet for 2.5 years on the pandemic because I have some experience in public health, economics, and previous pandemics of AIDS in particular. And my conclusion at the end of it was that the virus could well have come out of a US-funded, US-China laboratory project that went badly wrong by accident because the US was funding genetic manipulation of the SARS virus in a way that could really have created this virus. We don't know because neither the US government nor the Chinese government is saying a word about it. And both are saying, don't look here, go look over at the market. But at the market, there were no animals that were infected that they could find. Almost nothing about the market has any credibility, actually. It's just a place where people sneezed on cages, it looks like, because all the samples that were collected at the market were human samples for sure, and all of them were collected too late December, probably 2 or 3 months after the original event had taken place and spilled into the human population. So I think it's possible that the pandemic itself was human-caused. In any event, the outcome of the pandemic was a mess everywhere because no one was very good at stopping the pandemic. The Asian countries were the best because they had more experience with SARS. So Taiwan, from the first moment, said, we don't trust the mainland, we lock down. They had very few cases. China locked down early on. It's only unlocking now, but it basically had very few deaths. And the rest of the world, including Europe and the United States, South America, or Latin America, Africa, it was a huge disaster, I would say, because our governments were not prepared for this, and because the virus was really, really transmissible, and probably transmissible because it had 4 amino acids called the furin cleavage site in the protein, in the spike protein of this virus that quite possibly were stuck in there to make it very infectious, because that was the experiment that the scientists wanted to do. Let's see what happens when we add in a furin cleavage site into this virus. That may be what happened. In any event, huge supply shock, which we're not out of yet. Then, and interesting, the reaction of the Fed to the supply shock and the US government. Well, they couldn't agree on anything in the US, including even should we wear these things. This became the most political issue in the United States, face masks. They did pour a tremendous amount of money into so-called macroeconomic stabilization in response to the shock. So the United States ran a budget deficit of general government of 14% of GDP in 2020, which is a lot, by the way. And we spent about $7 trillion, which is a lot even for the US, which is a $23 trillion economy. $7 trillion over 3 packages to respond to the shock, to replace lost wages, to give businesses financial support, to pay the payroll of businesses, to pay rents, and many things. The Fed bought about half of the debt, a massive monetization of the debt, which started in March 2020, the biggest increase of base money in history, anywhere by far, of course. About $3 trillion of base money pushed into the economy from March 2020 onward. That's where a lot of the inflationary impulse was created. The ECB, less in the same direction, but maybe at half the scale of what the Fed did. But the Fed really pumped up the money supply and pumped up the fiscal stimulus. But people couldn't spend any of this money, of course. The whole point was stay home. And so the saving rates soared to the highest rates we ever had, to 25% personal saving rates, for example, until the economy began to be opened up. So the first impulse of the money was to boost stock market prices and Bitcoin prices and tokens prices. We had a huge rise of every asset price possible. And then within a year, the monetary mechanism pushed it into commodities, and within 2 years into the mainstream economy. So this was a supply shock met by an overreaction to the shock, because it was a big overcompensation. And the Fed went overboard not to make sure there was no financial crisis like 2008 by flooding the economy with liquidity. And that's the first roots of what we're experiencing right now. There definitely are monetary roots. But then, of course, came, on top of all of this, the war. And just a word about the war. In my view, the war could have been avoided at the end of 2021, and it could have been stopped in March 2022. The issue, to my mind, all along is NATO enlargement as the central issue here. Putin has said since the Bucharest NATO summit of 2008, don't do that. Don't you come up to our borders in Ukraine, much less Georgia. And of course, George Bush, as part of this vision that I learned about the hard way 30 years ago, was pushing the US vision of a unipolar world with NATO everywhere. You know, the first wave of NATO, which was Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland in 1999, was opposed by Russia and contrary to the promise, but not violently opposed, I would say. I think the Russians were very frustrated, but this was Central Europe. This was far from the borders. This wasn't any kind of direct military threat. Maybe it was a cheat on what the promises were, but it wasn't a direct threat. It happened. But under George W. Bush Jr., there were 7 more NATO enlargements, and those were close to home. The 3 Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia. But the real clincher, in my mind, was the 2008 Bucharest summit, where Bush said, we will expand to Ukraine and to Georgia. Because if you look at a map, that means surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And it means Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Georgia, completely surrounding Russia in its basic outlet to not only the Black Sea, but to the Eastern Mediterranean. And to my mind, it was like the first Crimean War, which was exactly the intent of Palmerston and Napoleon III, take Russia out of the Black Sea. And this is the second Crimean War, in my view, in the same way. A kind of, I call it neoconservative madness of the United States, unwilling to hear the concern of the other side at all. So in December 2021, Putin made a last attempt. 3 conditions put on the table. Crimea remains Russian, the Minsk II agreement is implemented, and NATO not enlarge. And Biden brushed them all aside, said we're not negotiating over any of that. And then the war, the invasion came on February 24th of this year. Clearly, the idea of the first phase of the war was to shock the Zelensky government into negotiating. And indeed, in mid-March, the Ukrainians gave the Russians a piece of paper which said, we will agree to neutrality and will agree to put the issues of the Donbass and Crimea down the road. And on that basis, Putin said, draft an agreement, and the Turkish mediators were close to an agreement, and then Ukraine walked out of the negotiations at the end of March. I don't know why, but I suspect because the US told them to. I don't know for sure. But suddenly the Ukrainians said to the Turks, we're not negotiating anymore, we're putting a pause to the negotiations. And Zelensky's new position, which was radically different from March, was we will only negotiate after Russia is kicked out of every square meter of Ukraine, including Crimea. Good luck on that one. And we've been in the war since then. So this is obviously the second huge shock. And the US thought that kicking Russia out of SWIFT and confiscating $300 billion of foreign exchange reserves would crush the Russian economy, and that the world would side with the US on this. And the reality has turned out to be quite different, which is that probably the Russian economy is still functioning okay, I would say, maybe not. I'd love to hear the views here. I think okay. The exports have continued at a somewhat diminished level, but have continued to China and especially India and to the East. And diplomatically, the US, Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore are the team, but the rest of the world says, please don't get us involved. And so it's quite different from a world opposed to Russia. It's really the EU, UK, US, and a few countries in Asia opposed to Russia. And of course, the most enthusiastic country of all, even more than the United States, is the United Kingdom. They just love this because this really is the second Crimean War for them. And they're so excited, so pleased. I think Boris Johnson really thought he was Palmerston and that he was going to be Palmerston or Churchill, but probably Palmerston. And this is the kind of complete mess that we're in. This is quite bad for the European economy, in my view, and Europe, I think, has misunderstood, or whatever, has sided with the US approach in a way that makes no sense from the European economy and that is quite destructive of the European economy. And the most vigorous of this, not the most gung-ho, which is definitely the Baltic states and Poland, but the key to this is Germany, and Germany's by far the biggest economic loser of this whole operation, and I think the costs are quite long-term and serious for Germany, and unless the war ends quickly. So just to finish that thought, my view continues to be that the war should end through negotiations, and the negotiations should have three parts to them. No NATO enlargement, Crimea remains de facto in Russian hands, and something is done about the Donbass. I don't know what. Maybe it's too late. But rather than reducing it to rubble, it would be better to have even a frozen conflict, if not a full negotiated outcome. I believe that this is possible, and I believe the United States neoconservatives still reject it because they are still after victory, but I don't think victory is coming on the battlefield, and I think the costs for Europe are very, very high, and the costs for the world are quite high. So this is the next supply shock. So what to do about supply shocks? First, the main lesson is central banks cannot fix supply shocks. Sorry to say. Central banks can keep financial systems from imploding. Central banks can be lenders of last resort. Central banks can maintain liquidity. Central banks can maintain monetary stability. But central banks cannot fix supply shocks. Supply shocks are real economy shocks, and they cannot be cured by central banks. So the only way to address supply shocks macroeconomically is through addressing the shocks themselves. You end the pandemic, stop the war, and build resilience to the climate change. It's the only way. It's a lot harder than finding some kind of macroeconomic instrument. But because it is a real economy shock, it can't be solved by an aggregate demand instrument or a financial instrument per se. Oh, but that means hard work by governments. And that is what our governments are not so great at in general, especially, I'll say, my own. it's what we really need to do is understand the shocks and face them as the way to proceed. I'll close these meandering remarks with some words about sustainability, about the environmental side of the story, just quickly. In all of this mess, one piece is, of course, the human-induced climate change. It's one of 5 or 10 major challenges, not the only one, but it's big and it's very serious. And I had the honor and great but deeply unpleasant experience of guiding an institute of several hundred climate scientists for 15 years at Columbia University. And it was unpleasant because they're wonderful people who scare the daylights out of you, because they quietly come up to you and say, the world is over. And they do it in a very convincing way with statistics and computer simulation models and brilliant science that you can't argue with. And my most terrifying colleague is a wonderful gentleman, James Hansen, who was the chief scientist, climate scientist of NASA for 30 years and is a professor at Columbia. He's absolutely brilliant. And not a month went by in 15 years where he didn't say to me, Jeff, it's worse than we thought. In other words, it's accelerating faster, the ice sheets are being destroyed faster, the thermal hailing circulation is slowing faster, the aerosol masking of climate change is diminishing faster. He's really afraid. And my advice to you is, if James Hansen's afraid of it, you should be afraid of it too. This is very real and it's extremely serious. And one of the issues of the human, of our environment, is that it's a highly nonlinear system. And so the idea of tipping points is a real thing. We have phase changes in nature. You go a little bit warmer, you go from ice to liquid. You go a little bit warmer, the West Antarctic ice sheet disintegrates, as an example, or the permafrost melts, or the ocean circulation stops or slows decisively. All of these things are happening right now. All these tipping points are in process. We don't know exactly what the thresholds, and when I say we, I mean James Hansen doesn't, because I don't know anything that he doesn't know. But he says they're close. So on that score, there are 2 major things to do. One is to mitigate the human forcings, and that means dramatically reducing the greenhouse emissions. And the second is adaptation, which means living with the warming that's going to go on for the next century or more. Because even if we stop all emissions now, the warming continues for decades to come, because the Earth has not yet reached thermal equilibrium with the emissions that we've already done, because it takes decades for the oceans to warm. And so the oceans are still absorbing huge amounts of net energy flux coming from the greenhouse emissions we already have. And as the oceans warm, the overall Earth system warms, and that process is going to go on for another century, no matter what the emissions we have. So this is quite serious. And on the mitigation side, of course, the center of the mitigation is a zero carbon energy system and ending the net emissions from nature, from deforestation, and from the farm system. So that's a lot to talk about, and I won't say too much about it, and I'm sure many of you know a lot about it, but we do need to decarbonize the energy system. In this regard, Hungary is relatively better placed than a lot of other countries because you are already substantially zero not 50% and rising zero carbon electricity, which is the key. And building more of the nuclear power, to my mind, is the right choice, as long as you take care that it's safe. But it is a right choice. Of course, it should be augmented with other renewables, and what Prime Minister Orban has been saying, that it needs to be part of a multi-country transmission system, is really important, because there is no way for any single country to have a zero carbon resilient energy system. It must be part of a network that is broader and that has more points of distribution of these intermittent energy sources. You'll have base energy, but others on wind and solar and so forth need a distributed system. This, to my mind, is another reason why the destruction of Nord Stream was so awful, because we need cross-border trade in energy. Of course, the gas would have had to diminish over time and probably be replaced by hydrogen in the pipeline. And that's probably what would have happened over time. But the idea, the US new idea, is that trade, they call it dependency. Europe shouldn't be dependent on Russia. This is stupid, actually. Europe shouldn't, it's mainly saying Europe shouldn't trade with Russia. Of course, there should be mutual dependency. It's called international trade. But now we're in a mood of, we need self-sufficiency, we need everything at home. You cannot have green systems in autarkic environment. We need transmission across national boundaries, even for gas. And the idea that this was some fatal mistake of Germany to enter into dependency on Russia is just a ridiculous American idea, by the way. Not an American idea, American strategists' idea, because they're viewing the world not in terms of sustainability or economic well-being, but in terms of who's up and who's down, a zero-sum vision of the world, not a actual economic vision of the world. Because in economics, we don't have the concept of dependency on imports. We have the concept of trade, which is mutually beneficial. So we are going to need a grid. And I hope that Hungary really promotes a broad grid. It should, by the way, in the end, once this war is over, sooner rather than later, include Russia again. It should build out wind in the Black Sea region, which is absolutely plentiful and a massive investment. It should actually integrate also with North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, which have huge amounts of sunshine. So that is not the central bank's main function, except to say to the government, that's your function. And that's what really needs to be done. You can help to facilitate a financial system which supports these transformations, which measures the risks of not doing this, which takes into account the shocks that will come in a system that either economically or in a regulatory way or in an environmental way proves to be unsustainable. But this is really where we need our governments to stop the wars and start the cooperation. Thank you very much.